Thank you very much, Scotty, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. So I'm just going to move this so I can see you all better. So I'm going to give you an overview of what I think are the most important things to conceptualize for this next 2 days. And as Scotty has mentioned, the pillars of what we're here for today are fundamentally circadian and quantum biology, ancestral nutrition, and regenerative farming. The question that is relevant is why these three, and out of all these other potential inputs and approaches to the problem of chronic disease and the problems of ill health that society is facing. So it really comes down to centralization and decentralization. And I think this is a really useful and helpful way of thinking about the problem and therefore the solutions. So a really pictorial and simple way of thinking about this is a centralized network. As you can see, there's one big node, and from that node, all the others are basically taking their instructions, taking their cues. But you contrast that with a decentralized system. Decentralized systems have multiple nodes, and I'm going to explain to you why the benefits of this approach. So let's have a think. And I'm just going to use in this situation a CAFO confined feeding operation. So where they raise pork in an industrial situation. And what you'll realize and what I'll explain is that we can substitute other centralized systems in for this, and the principles will make sense to you the same. So a centralized system, as I alluded to, has fewer larger entities, and this really promotes a monoculture. This is the opposite of a polyculture. This is favoring the centralization and monoculture of a system. There's fundamentally top-down control. The way that these animals are raised, the way an agricultural system or an industrial food system is organized is really through top-down control. There's a lack of transparency from us as individuals, as customers, as consumers. We often don't know what is necessarily going in to the production, say, of this pork, because we're removed from the process. There's many layers in between us and the outcome of this food. There's a fragility in a centralized systems. And if anyone remembers back to the COVID pandemic, particularly in the US, where there was such centralization of their animal processing and slaughtering facilities, that the removal or the shutdown of those facilities due to biosecurity issues essentially sent shockwaves throughout the whole country and threatened the food security of that whole nation. And that is fundamentally what can happen when you have a centralized system. Prone to regulatory capture. And what this essentially means is that big corporations who have interests to their shareholders, financial interests, influence the regulatory mechanisms, the way that food and these processes are influenced by the government. And they do so in favor of corporate profit and away from things that are important like human health, biosphere health. And as I mentioned, it's a fundamentally system that's aligned for the corporate and centralized profit rather than individual. So this is considered highly efficient, and there are efficiencies. This is a great way of feeding a large number of people at scale, and we need to remember why these systems have arisen. But essentially, what I'm going to explain, and I think what a lot of the speakers are going to be talking about today, is that is in many cases in opposition to individual health, the health of you, the health of your family. So let's contrast that with a decentralized system. And I've used this photo of Farmer Jake in his paddock with his pastured pigs. There's many smaller entities, many smaller regenerative farms, many smaller, say, artisanal food producers. There's no central controller. There's much more transparency. You know what has gone on when there is less people in between you and, say, your food source. There's a redundancy, and this means that when something goes wrong, if a farm gets shut down, if there's a drought, if there's any other form of issue that interrupts supply of that network, the network isn't interfered with because you haven't taken down a big centralized node, and there's other nodes that can even compensate. And that is a concept of anti-fragility, is not only can the network is robust to disruption, but it can actually improve and get better in response to shocks and perturbations. Less prone to capture because it's essentially a flatter network structure. And the economic incentives fundamentally favor the individual farmer, the individual producer. And this is considered highly inefficient. And again, this is because the way society we have gone is not putting value on a whole bunch of very, very important human aspects to health and the environment. So, like I said, I've used examples of confined, fed, and pastured pork, but you can use an idea of a canola monocrop or syntropic agriculture. Or you could also substitute in multinational food industry like Unilever or these other multinational operations, and contrast that with a local farmers market. So how does this affect people? And at the end of the day, this is about you, this is about your families, this is about people, this is about community. And centralized systems they're insensitive to these intangible needs that we have as people. And what Dr. Pradhan Yoganathan has often referred to as soul. It's just extractive. These processes are fundamentally extractive. And not because I believe there's any necessarily intent of malicious intent, but really they're just simply not aligned to incentivize things like nourishing the soil, regenerating the soil, nourishing people. And again, the interests of shareholders and corporations is their first priority. So what about decentralized systems? And this is Stuart and his family on their property. And fundamentally, decentralized systems can respect and support these more human, intangible needs, and nourishing communities and their families, and help to replenish the commons, like the soil, like the water. So the underlying theme, as we've talked about, of these three pillars that make up this Regenerate movement is decentralization. And I hope that I've helped you understand why that's something valuable and why that's something that we should be striving towards in community. So you can start with yourself, and this is only some really brief points and to think about for the next 2 days in terms of taking away actionable steps. But financially supporting your local regenerative farmer, eating local and chemical-free produce, requesting things like seed-oil-free and ethically raised dining options. These are all very real and applicable. And finally, educating people on health and these issues, because this is a grassroots movement. And I like to say, this isn't going to be tomorrow. It's not going to show up in national guidelines or on 7 News. That's just not how it works for the reasons that we mentioned. So talking to people when they're ready, when they're interested and ready to hear this message is going to be important. Look, I'm going to talk about some key issues that only to put here that you can think about and how you might translate this or implement going forward. And these are decisions that are made centrally that impact our local health. And as much as I think it's tempting to want to step away from decisions of politics and the way perhaps all these centrally administered decisions, they actually affect individuals, they affect us locally, and they affect how we can implement decentralized systems. So excessive regulation on the small scale slaughter of animals, something I've talked with Jake at length about. The prohibition on unpasteurized milk and dairy products, essentially dairy in the form that it was consumed for millennia, and the fact that many products of dependency are legally available and taxed, yet milk in its unpasteurized form is not available. So the general attack on animal source foods for whatever reason, whether that's climate, temperature, or so-called human health. The potential blanket use of novel gene technology in livestock, ongoing use of broadacre herbicides like glyphosate, which have established adverse human health effects, incandescent lighting, and the fact that and it's ironic that we're standing under some right now. We've got the doors open though, so we've got some natural solar radiation sneaking its way in. But the fact that these are being used in all our indoor settings, and I'm going to talk about that more tomorrow in my talk, and the use of things like Wi-Fi and blue light in classrooms and in sensitive areas. And finally, the centralization and the digitization and control of money. And I think that is a topic for a complete another day, but that is a very fundamental underlying theme that affects all the others and more. So that's some things to think about. Thank you for attending today. Thank you for attending this week. It's going to be a very intimate event, and I'm really glad that each and every one of you have decided to make the effort to join us. And there's some amazing speakers coming over the next 2 days, and I think we're going to learn a lot. So thank you all again, and let's get on with the summit.